My name is Wyatt Mason. I'm a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center and a writer in residence at Bard. And I wanted to begin, for those of you who are guests here and whose interaction with the Hannah Arendt Center is this annual conference, I wanted to mention and thank Roger Berkowitz, the director of the center, and also call your, yes, let's... He does a remarkable job in this public role of bringing public conversation into this space every year on a topic of some urgency. He does it with a group that he's brought together of really remarkable people, including the operations director, Tina Stanton, who plans and makes this work extremely well. He's also brought on board Samantha Rose Hill, who's a distinguished scholar and a fine professor, and she's working as the assistant director of the center now. And Thomas Wild, who's the research director of the Arendt Center, with a deep expertise in all things Arendt and German literature, philosophy, and history. And I want you to know, those of you, again, who are guests, that the conversation that happens in this room that Roger's attempting to curate is something that's happening every day at the Hannah Arendt Center with the students who come and take classes with Roger and the other fellows, and the kinds of conversations that Roger is dedicated to bringing out take place everywhere that he is. He's enormously committed to this venture in all its forms. And so if you're a Bard student and you haven't had a chance to take a class with Roger or any of the fellows at the center, I encourage you to do so, and I encourage you to come by. So let me say a few words about Teju Cole, our guest. And I'm going to actually read a text that was written by Norman Rush, one of the great American writers, about Teju Cole that I've amended only to bring its statistics up to the present day. Because in the months that have passed since Norman Rush wrote this for the New York Review of Books, Teju's numbers have even increased, as you'll understand in a moment. Norman Rush writes, Teju Cole is a kind of realm. He has written 4 books, 2 exceptional novels, Every Day is for the Thief, and Open City, a volume of essays, Known and Strange Things, a sequence of photographs counterpointed with short text called Blind Spot, as well as many uncollected essays, interviews, newspaper columns, and a vast online oeuvre made up of skeins of tweets on fixed themes, faits divers, email arguments, captioned Instagrams, mixed media exercises, and rants. At the moment, he is credited with more than 13,300 tweets, 265,000 Twitter followers, 135 photos, and approximately, as of this hour, although I imagine it will grow in the next 45 minutes, 27,647 fans who officially like his Facebook page. Even in a time when many writers are enlarging their literary footprints by means of the internet, he is a prodigy. There's a strong sense of interconnectedness between the different parts of his work. Cole's personal stories, sometimes given straight, sometimes fictionalized, pervades. The bicultural Teju Cole was born in the US in 1975, raised in Nigeria until his 17th year, brought back to America, where he first studied art and then attended medical school and then went abroad to study African art history and later studied Northern Renaissance art at Columbia. His initial novels brought him a storm of prizes and attention. He's been a writer in residence here at Bard. We miss him. He is currently the photography critic for the New York Times Magazine, a position which he christened, and to which last month, and this is my edition, he contributed an essay about the work of Boston photographer Maria Cosindas, in which he writes, the experience of looking at a selection of her photographs, he says, is like watching a single sentence unfurl over several pages, driven along by an invisible inner consistency. Those 2 clauses of Cole's appearing in his own 1,491-word single sentence that described those photographs. Cole has the ability to perform in the substance of his prose the thing that he's trying to argue. He's an exhibiting photographer on top of everything else and has been for a long time, and he has said that his writings on photography are those that are the most important in his body of work to him. He's very conscious of the difference between what one might think of as books aimed at a presumed posterity, and we could put the novels and the essays on one side of that, and his online work aimed at real-time and frequently interactive fandom. As he said in conversation with MacArthur Fellow and novelist Alexander Heyman, quote, "For sure, some of the smartest and most interesting literary minds of our generation and the generations to come will work in areas that are not books, as we currently think of them, but I think of some of these people will also write books," and Cole is certainly one of those. His essays, which I commend to you, are brilliantly written, sharp, intelligent, and yield a pleasurable sweetness, Rush says. His prose and its variations is impeccably where he wants it to be. His erudition is put to work humbly, but in encountering these essays, perhaps the most important quality to grasp is Cole's deep sense of the seriousness of life, which is sustained in different registers, rotating through his compositions and sometimes shouldering aside their announced subjects is an array of thematic problems routinely confounding to the educated, secular, left-centric urban readership of today who we are. Here are two examples among the many that Cole discusses. One, in a world that is post-creedal, post-religion, post-socialism, in what should humanism be grounded? Two, when liberal empires engage in overseas criminality, what are the responsibilities of that empire's domestic beneficiaries, the lucky, the talented, the wealthy, all of us? I couldn't be happier to welcome Teju Cole to this stage. I so look forward to his remarks, and I want to leave you with one sentence of his that strikes me as, in its brevity, in its concentration, and its focused power, gives rise to deep thinking in a listener or reader. In an essay, Cole writes, "We are our habits in sum." Please welcome Teju Cole.
Thank you, Wyatt, for your dastardly ploy to distract me with excessive praise. I'm very humbled by that introduction. It's very nice to be back here in my old stomping grounds. I don't do enough stomping here these days, and being back, I realize that I miss it, so I'm going to have to come back as soon as possible. Gosh, that's the kind of introduction that makes one nervous, actually. I don't do nerves. I'm not really looking forward to my brief prefatory statement. I'm looking forward to the conversation with Professor Mason here, because he's one of the best minds. Has anybody here read Wyatt? Exquisite stylist, extraordinary thinker, and I'm just looking forward to what sparks might fly. I've always been honored to call him a colleague and a fellow teacher. Thanks very much also to everybody who organized this, particularly to Roger, who thought that I might have something to say, and I've enjoyed the conversations we've had leading up to this. Thank you so much for the work you do, and for Tina for organizing everything. And for all of you for being here these last 2 days. I'm not sure whether to thank you for being so well behaved. I think there could have been more rabble-rousing. But don't start now. I mean, if you were polite for everybody else, might as well be polite for me. My talk is called After Mediocrity. And what I really have is a question, which I'll have at the very end, rather than a statement. But I want to think my way through to that question. I grew up in Nigeria. I was born in the US. As a child, I think one of my peculiarities was that I feared disaster. I thought about it a lot. to all external appearances, I was a normal kid. Happy home. Parents took care of us, encouraged us to go to school and do arts. And yet I was obsessed with the possibility of disaster. I think some of that came through observing my environment. I grew up in a country that had a lot of military coups, these sort of sudden rapid changes of government. But some of it also came out of reading. You know, this idea that history was dark and that there was something unusual about being shielded from the worst that history had to offer. Nigeria had had a war. It was over before I was born, and so on. So there was always this thought, when is the next thing going to happen? It didn't happen while I was growing up in Nigeria. There was a war in Liberia, there was a war in Sierra Leone, and even like, you know, as a 13-year-old, as a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, I was already making sort of commitments to myself. You know, I'll never sign up for a war. I'll never, you know, commit atrocities. I'll never go along with people who do such things. The moment never really came. I think the disaster came late last year for me as an adult living in the United States. And it caused me to think back to my childhood self. That boy who could not have imagined that it would be in this shape and in this form, that the house would burn down in this way. I'm talking about after mediocrity, and I mean after in two senses. After mediocrity, talking about them, their pursuit of mediocrity. They go after mediocrity. Why would anyone do that? I mean, the reason anyone does anything, because of the advantages it proffers. Being mediocre is easier than being excellent. But I think they're also mediocre because they cannot be otherwise. The solecisms, the misspeaking, the tin-eared emotional responses to emergencies, the procedural fuck-ups. These things are not coincidental, and they're not mere matters of style. They're actually inherent in the mindset of this group of people who have seized the reins of power. They pursue mediocrity. But I also mean after mediocrity, maybe in the first sense that you thought of when you heard that title, which is, what are we to do after these mediocrities depart the stage, whenever it is that they do so? I think there's good reason to think that it might be a while, but there will be an aftermath. How do we prepare for that? What is it possible to preserve and defend in the midst of the disaster, for the moment after the disaster? What is being threatened is our humanity. What can we do to protect our humanity for the moment when the inhumane go back into the sewers from whence they have temporarily emerged? And I talk about preserving the humane in the midst of disaster because the disaster is ongoing. I take issue a little bit with this idea that this is a crisis. I want to dial it up a little bit and say it has gone beyond crisis, and it is the disaster. Maurice Blanchot writes, "The disaster ruins everything while leaving everything intact." this is the disaster. Even though the HVAC is working and there's electricity and the campus is tranquil, the disaster ruins everything while leaving everything intact. For me, this is related to an idea I've been sort of developing, that the disaster is here, but it is not evenly distributed. Okay? Which is a riff on Gibson's idea that the future is here, is not evenly distributed. The disaster is here, it is just not evenly distributed. We need to snap out of the habit of what if things get really bad? Things are already really bad. Depends on who you ask. What if things get really bad for us? Us? We? We who? A young man who was slaughtered in Portland for standing up for two women who had been racially abused. The disaster arrived for him. Families that have been torn apart, not just this year, last year, the year before that, because of our inhospitality. The disaster is present for them. I will say something about the dead later. One of the things most severely under threat in a disaster, or in a crisis, in fact, is the ability to be subtle, the ability to be interwoven in our intellectual activity. An earthquake is not a precision weapon. And in reaction to seismic change, I feel we're all pressured to retreat only to fundamentals. We exile ourselves from whatever is not immediate, whatever is not necessary. In our hysteria, everything becomes weaponized. And those little things that we were hoping to save from the disaster become lost. And so I want to speak to you as an artist who wants to think about what an artist can do, who wants to think about what art can offer in the middle of the disaster and in anticipation of the moment afterwards. Okay, so I want to think a little bit more about excellence and mediocrity. Michel Leiris writes about etymology in 1925, about how it is, etymology doesn't give us a real, academics love just throwing in etymology, and the real meaning of this word is, if we go back to the Greek and Latin roots, etymology, according to Leiris, doesn't give us a real meaning of the word, right? Etymology gives us a verifiable aspect of the formal history of the word. But he says that the real meaning of the word, it's the private resonances, the echoes of what it does inside you. So free association and puns and all of that, that's what the word means. I like that very much. But I also like etymologies because they have some kind of oracular and divinatory properties. So an etymology is not the real meaning of the word, it is a kind of hammer with which we can strike the bell of the word, I think. Etymology of excellence. We really should be paying sort of taxes to maybe both the French and the Germans, because English just comes from, if it's not French, it's German. Excellence is French. And then obviously Latin. Ex, out of. And that excellence part, celere, is towering, distinguished, superior. Proto-Indo-European kel, K-E-L, shows up in a lot of words, but also, domed, cell. So that which goes even beyond the height of the tower, excellence. Mediocrity is also French. Funny, strange meaning, mediocrity, medio, right? Medium. And that CR, the crity, acre, AKR, is, the sense of it is also of a promontory, of a height. So we have like the Acropolis or the Acme. So mediocrity is something of medium height. Okay, so these are the limits of etymology, because that's not what mediocrity means. Mediocrity means something that sucks, which is a sense that emerged in the 16th century. But maybe out of an intuition that to just be middling, to be okay, is a kind of not being good enough. We are surrounded with what is just barely okay. In the way that the government is run, I mean, far from being good enough. Okay. We must historicize. We cannot avoid analogies to history. I mean, speaking of disasters, it was disastrous to have had a speaker here today that refused to countenance history. The world is not created ex nihilo every morning. When you refuse to understand the lessons of history, that in itself is to be disastrous. And when we speak in analogies, does not mean that we're saying something is exactly like the other. We're saying that it has aspects that can help us think about the other thing. That is exactly how analogies work, And so people sort of rush in and say, well, I don't think you can compare those two things. But that's exactly what you can do with two things. You can compare them and then find out how close they are to each other and how close they are not, and find out what part of it is helpful. I want to think about the music I listened to on the morning of November 10th in grief. I listened to Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, Quartet pour la fin du temps, written in 1941, while Messiaen was a prisoner of war camp, in a prisoner of war camp in Poland, very close to the Eastern German border, Görlitz. He had been a member of the French army, had been arrested, and he was in this prisoner of war camp. And that's what I wanted to listen to. And it's something I've been going back to this year, because I've been trying to understand not only the sensation of extremity, but also the possibility of working in the intolerable. There's a friendly guard, a man by the name of Brühl, who made paper available to the composer and put him in a barracks where he would not be disturbed, and put a guard in front of it and give him pencil. The form of the quartet is very unusual. It's a piano, cello, violin, and clarinet, because those are the musicians that he found there. He was playing piano, 3 other people playing these instruments. Simple in form, radical, based on some other things he had composed before, but largely circling around a repetition of E major chords the last two movements, in the last three movements, the third to the last and the ultimate movement were both scored for two instruments each. So this is a piece of very, very character. Not purely mournful, and I think that's important also. It contains birdsong, it contains sort of like raucous, peasant-like dances. But that third to the last movement, that last movement, are both duets. One for piano and cello, and the other for violin and piano. I know of no other work in the repertoire that has four people on stage and has such vast silences for particular instruments. Almost everybody who sits on stage for that piece has like stretches, 10 minutes, where they're not even playing at all. It's an extraordinary piece. It's dying out at the end there. It was first played on a wet January night, pretty much outside, at the camp, to an audience of 300 people, including the guards. Freezing night. And you think about the possibility of such a thing in such a place. I want us to think about the possibility that we have of the things we can do in such a place as this. I'm going to quote something. There are no strangers. There are only versions of ourselves, many of which we have not embraced, most of which we wish to protect ourselves from. For the stranger is not foreign, she is not random, not alien, but remembered. And it is the randomness of the encounter with our already known, though unacknowledged selves that summons a ripple of alarm. That's Toni Morrison writing in her new book, The Origin of Others. A book that I've read with such great consolation, not only for the words it contains, but because it was published now, originally delivered as the Norton Lectures at Harvard last year, already at a moment of crisis, and now published in the moment of disaster. There are no strangers. For me, the move to arrive there is a form of rejecting mediocrity and achieving a kind of excellence. Because mediocrity is not only about the fact that the people in the White House are bumbling idiots. Sure, they're morons. But there's a different kind of mediocrity which we could see in the people who confined Olivier Messiaen and his fellow musicians. There is such a thing as moral mediocrity. And we are living with that as well. And moral mediocrity sees complexity and chooses simplicity. It makes a choice to flatten human experience to fit stories that are simply not true of what we've been, what we are, and what we could be. I like The Origin of Others very much because for me it contains the characteristic of all great art that comes out of disaster, which is that it has a fine balance of both directness and obliquity. The best we can bring out of that situation, any situation we might be facing, is something that speaks to it, but that does not limit itself to it. And so, for example, in the course of the book, she also thinks about and talks about colorism and racism, but in a surprising way. She talks about the way race is often used as shorthand for characters in fiction, and about how this forecloses the possibility of those characters, even talking about their race, so that they become diminished to stereotypes. And she talks very frankly and movingly about moments in her work where she regrets having introduced a character's race because of the way that sort of shuts it down. I love to be in the presence of thinking that cannot be reduced to placards. Well, she's not necessarily going to say, oh, Black Lives Matter. That is so obvious as to be absurd to need stating in that context. But nor is she saying the all lives matter that becomes an escape for white Americans from their responsibilities towards racial justice. She's saying think deeper, look closer. And this is the kind of thinking we need in addition to the activism that we need, in addition to good legislation and good defense lawyers. I said I was going to say something about the dead. The camp that Olivier Messiaen was in is called Stalag 8A. It was disastrous. It was terrible. In fact, some of the friendlier guards encouraged some of the Jewish prisoners not to attempt to escape because it was better for them in there than in Vichy, France. So it was disastrous. It was not the worst. Primo Levi survived Auschwitz, as everybody in this room knows. And in The Drowned and the Saved, he has a haunting idea, which is about the possibility of bearing witness, how attenuated that is, because the one who bears witness is the one who survived. Those who experience the worst cannot bear witness because they died. If you saw the full extent of the horror, you cannot bear witness to it. You're dead. If you're in that category just below that, you saw the full extent of it and somehow made it out alive, you don't come out right. And then he puts himself somewhere lower than that and says that this is how troubled it is. Hesitating to find an articulation of the kind of privilege. How can it be said that somebody has privilege in a place like Auschwitz? That's what he means by it. I have sort of ended up sketching out 3 possible ways of thinking of the ongoing. Maybe for some people it is a crisis. I know that for me it is a disaster. And for others yet, it is an apocalypse. It is for them already the end of the world, the end of time. If I can get up in the morning and manage to put some sentences together or make images, that is a privilege within the disaster. But because I have a privilege within the disaster does not mean that I'm experiencing the worst of it. It does not mean that others are not experiencing the worst of it. I was at an event with a fellow author who sort of looked out of the audience and said, you know, it's really terrible what's going on, you know, but we're going to be all right, at least. I said, well, we who? What do you mean by that? He said, well, people, you know, who've come to our event, paid, have money to come to a ticket, you know, buy a ticket. I said, well, you don't know that, you know. I said, do you know if they're Muslims in the audience? Do you know if they're Mexican people? Do you know if they're people who have insecure immigration status? I found that self-indulgent, found it lazy. and it's a we I hear a lot. And yesterday, I was talking to somebody who's not here with us, who said, "What am I in town for?" And I said, "There's a conference." And he said, "What's the conference about?" I said, "Well, it's about, the crisis in democracy." And then I paused, and I said, "Things are really bad." And he said, "Well, I don't see a whole lot of people leaving if things are so bad. This is still the best country," he said. That's moral mediocrity. Democracy is a thorny question, and one possible response to the question of American democracy is to respond to it as Gandhi did when asked about Western civilization. I think it would be a good idea. Even with all the complications that have been put on the question of what constitutes democracy at all, we don't have it. I don't even think we've gotten started yet. And we have to take that idea seriously. What does it mean to systematically disenfranchise so very many people? But now, added to our lack of democracy, we're dealing with, maybe we had some form of aristocracy and, oligarchy. And now we're dealing with the rule of the worst, the most corrupt, the most incompetent, kakistocracy. And we're dealing also with the rule of the mob, the loudest voices, the most unpleasant voices, the most mediocre voices, the ones that want to build a wall, the ones who bay for blood, the ones who chant, "You will not replace us." Ochlocracy, the rule of the lynch mob. And it's not unrelated to majoritarianism, to the tyranny of the majority. I could not disagree more with those who suggest that identity politics is irrelevant. The biggest fan of identity politics are white men. So what are we to do when confronted by the worst, by the mob, by those who are worse than merely middling? I'm going to recommend maybe a third work to you. Read Toni Morrison's The Origin of Others. Listen to Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. And take a walk across campus to the Hessel Museum and go to the photography exhibition that's there right now, and make your way to a room in the middle where a single channel work with a soundtrack is playing, and it's called Love is the Message is Death, and it's by Arthur Jafa, J-A-F-A. I was very pleasantly surprised that it's playing here, because it was the most extraordinary work of art I saw last year. It's 7 minutes long, and it is an affective montage work about the Black American emotional landscape. And again, for me, it satisfies the need for art to be an amalgam of directness and also obliquity. So, I'm going to wrap this up. As a child, I feared disaster. Okay, so the disaster is here. It has arrived in a heterogeneous way. Racists who are not racists, words that don't have meaning, Nazis who are not Nazis, the disaster that leaves everything intact, the mediocre disaster, The question I want to pose, the question I said I would pose is, if we survive, for those of us who survive, who will we be after the disaster? Thank you.
Thank you, Teju. You say of etymology that it is the hammer that strikes the bell of a word. It's a clear image. It's the sound that rings on in the background, diminishing, but there. Mediocre is a fascinating word. I think it's an important word. I think it's the first time I've heard it applied to this condition that we're experiencing. And when I push back into the Latin etymology of the word, as I did, because it's the same reflex, I share it, two words come up: medius, middle, but ochrus, rugged mountain. So mediocre is this rugged, low, middle. Hardy, hard to conquer, and also the majority. Speaking only for myself, most of my endeavor in my life I would describe without judgment, without censure, as mediocre. That is to say, there is much in a life that one can't master, and that one is frequently limited. One frequently confronts one's limits, and one doesn't have the energy to surpass them all. And so we specialize. There's certain things that we devote ourselves to. Certainly education is a means by which we can surpass certain limits. And it sounds like what you're describing, and which I see very clearly as something in the world, it has not gone unmentioned that there's a great suspicion right now of expertise, and the Trump administration does seem to be exhibiting a consistent belief that expertise is suspicious. Climate change being the most egregious, clear example that we can have as something that it's astonishing that this could be advocated for, that, you know, that the experts are all wrong or not even worth listening to. So when you're asking the question, if we survive, who will we be? And if you're also asking, what can we do? You're asking it from different perspectives of citizenship. And you give us examples of different artists' engagements, and you yourself are the kind of artist who engages variously. And in fact, it's so interesting to me that you use a medium, Twitter, to communicate in a very subtle way, a word that you approvingly ask for us to seek in the world, subtlety. It's the same medium by which our president is managing to spread lies, misinformation, mistruths, slander, and aggressive taunts. That medium, that mediocrity, in its old sense, it is the middle, it is rugged, it is the thing, we live in it. Who are we? We are, all of us, fundamentally at risk every day of being mediocre. But we have a problem in that how do we persuade ourselves that that's not sufficient? And how do we persuade a polis that the way past it is through the idea that we can learn things? That seems, at least as an educator, something that one comes up against. This idea that one is essentially saying, in so many ways, that the student at a place like Bard College accepts is, you come to us with this limit. We're going to help you push past it. We're not going to do the pushing. We're going to give you the tools of pushing past it. But it seems like the ruggedness of this idea of mediocrity suggests that it's obdurate, that it's calcified, that it's fundamentally moveless.
Yeah.
So how do we push past it? How is it that we can, if you even believe in the framing of this, because as I'm hearing it, it's the idea that we have a problem with mediocrity. Agreed, that problem is now ruling us in all senses.
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely agree with the framing, simply for the reason of the limitations of etymology. So, average is different from mediocre. And the sense of it now has completely, they've diverged. I mean, in the 15th century, even the golden mean was called the golden mediocrity. So the meaning has really shifted. It's fine to be average in some things. What I really like is a usage that I've only noticed in the past few years, and largely from young people online. You know, if somebody is being foolish, you know, somebody will sort of write to them and be like, do better. I like that. I like the do better. Like, do better. Be better. And to exhort each other to do better. What I don't like is this thing of, oh, well, you can't expect people to ... People do that, say that all the time. Well, I mean, let's be realistic. You can't expect people to blah, blah, blah. I can. I do. Do better. You can't, you can't expect two white boys in a community college in Ohio to, no, well, I do. As it happens, I was just in rural Ohio 3-4 days ago, talking to a bunch of people, including some white boys, and I know exactly what my interaction with them was and what my expectations of them were, which is to meet them as equals and to say collectively, let's do better. So, yes, you don't have to be good at tennis. I'm sure you are, but you don't have to be. And, you can be, half of all cooks are below average. You don't have to be a great cook. Everybody should be really good at one dish. That's just good manners. But when it comes to the kinds of things I'm describing as moral mediocrity, when it comes to just sort of like basic hospitality to the thou in another, I think that's a standard we can expect of each other.
We can expect it is different from we can provoke it.
I don't think we can provoke it. I don't think we can provoke it. But I think part of the work is to help create that space where that can live in some way. No, we cannot force anybody to be good. We can try to defend the good. We can try to defend pluralism and liberal values. Not just through art, we can push each other through language and through policy. I think it's a wonderful thing that slightly ahead of the curve of German public opinion, Angela Merkel in late 2015 opened the doors and 1 million people came into Germany. That is creating a space where human beings may come in and live. I very much wish the United States were that way now, and I very much wish the United States was that way during World War II. To our lasting shame, we were not and we are not. So I think in our different areas of authority, we can have ways of creating a space that go a little bit beyond our comfort zone or even the comfort zone of our interlocutors to defend the higher thing, the deeper thing, the more hospitable thing, the more humane thing. Those things that we know that history will judge as having been the right thing.
Do you believe that through social media upon which you're active, the individual citizen can do things that are different from what the individual citizen could do in the past? Is it a means that you, in your experience with it, feel can offer the counterweight to the abusive way in which social media has been used in the last 5 years?
I think social media has been tremendous for the voiceless. I mean, imagine if you're some poor queer kid living in a village in the heart of the country. Social media is probably a kind of lifesaver for you. However, I feel that on balance, social media is terrible. On balance. I don't think this dude is president without Facebook and Twitter. Without even getting into Russian conspiracy theories. Without the free advertising, the scandalizability of people, the wish to serve as unwitting megaphones for outrage. Without any of that, he would have had to spend his own money and his reach would not have gone as far. But because of the cries of alarm that filled the public sphere with every utterance by him, he was able to really get the message to all those who, for their own reasons, might be disinclined to interrupt the system.
Yeah, my concern about the...
I'm not on Twitter anymore, for example. It's a terrible place.
When did you quit?
I haven't tweeted since 2014.
Oh, you haven't? Okay, so...
It has been observed that Trump got big on Twitter shortly after I stopped tweeting. And also that, I feel dirty even saying his name, and also that we've not been observed in the same room at the same time. So make of that what you will.
That throws a wrench into everything.
Absolutely. It might be the greatest performance art piece of all. Who knows? If only.
Oh, how we hope that to be true.
No, but in fact, what it is, as has been widely observed, it's as if a comments thread ran for office and won. It's pure id. We're not talking about a complex psychology. We're talking about enormous leverage and scale. He's a schoolyard bully who knows well the pleasure of sadism as only a sadist could know it. He knows what it does for him. And so all the outrage is just fuel because he knows how satisfying sadism is for him.
My concern with social media, which is expressed most clearly through the way in which Trump used it, is the idea that it's a medium that democratizes the ability of the individual to have a voice is instantly quashed when the medium is used to allow one voice to speak louder than all others. And my fear of that technology at this point is it's being performed every single day.
Right, and it's also in the hands of corporations. And so they effectively hold a kind of veto power over speech, so they can ban, a woman who's speaking out against sexual assault in a way that they don't like, but they cannot ban the President of the United States because they do not wish to. I've just thought of an analogy to what, the social media space feels like sometimes, which is, it's like nuclear power, the nuclear bomb, right? Any number of European countries get fairly clean, sort of dancing on the edge of the abyss, power from nuclear reactors. In some ways, it's cleaner than coal, until it's not. Meanwhile, there's this proliferation of nuclear weapons. So if somebody says, well, what do you think of nuclear? I mean, I don't tend to like panic when I'm on a train going through the European countryside and I see these stacks, because sort of you trust in the controls and that, and accidents are really rare and all of that. But then you think of Fukushima, but you also think of nuclear proliferation, and you think of the only nation that's dropped nuclear bombs, and you have to say, on the whole, thanks but no thanks, right? And I feel like social media is this incredible power that, on the whole, it does make some things much better. Again, it gives community to people who do not otherwise have it. It makes a kind of activism possible. But, it's like Pandora's box with 3 very pretty demons, but then the others are.
We're going to open up for question and answer now, but it occurs to me that it might not be the worst legislative idea for some future Congress to consider whether a sitting president should have the ability to tweet. It seems like something that might be worth considering, although I imagine it raises all kinds of free speech issues, but maybe it doesn't. I'm not a lawyer.
I mean, yeah, that's interesting.
We certainly have a strong argument for why a president shouldn't tweet, but in any case. Questions for Teju Cole in the audience? I see a hand here. If we could come down with the microphone to this young gentleman.
Afternoon.
Hello.
Hi. I have a question, which is probably why I'm holding a microphone. You asked the question, what should we do going forward? And this idea of expecting better from each other in terms of seeing each other as equals, treating each other as human beings. And currently at this time in our country's history, we're at a very divisive point on many different issues. To point one out would be gun control with the recent violence that happened in Las Vegas. And so you ask us this question, but I think I want to ask you the same question. What do you think is the best thing that we can do going forward? And what do you think is the best thing that we can do as this country? Because whether we like it or not, we are still a country. We are still one house. In a lot of ways, we are still a family. Families get into fights. But at the same time, we need to find a way to pull back together. And so what do you think is the best way going forward to expect better and to behave better towards each other as human beings?
Thank you. We're definitely not a family. That I find to be, it's a common analogy, and I find it to be a fairly toxic one. But we can find common cause. So one of the ways it gets better is to be in conversation with each other about what we can do to make it better. I mean, that's very important. Public dialogue. I mean, I think it starts on a personal level. You've got to be good to people around you. Because it is a disaster, you actually have to be nurturing to the people who are close to you, because they do need it. At this particular moment, a lot of people are in pain, and you have to be there for them. You have to do the work, and not only work that is responding to yesterday's headlines, because that's going to fade away, but the work that is going to outlast this. For me, that's a very important thing, to do work that will be relevant 10 years from now. And then you have to practice within yourself how not to be deafened by the noise of this. It's very noisy, it's very deafening. What disaster can bring out the best in people, people help each other, but disaster can also make us deeply ashamed of each other, because it can reveal our weaknesses, and it can reveal underlying prejudices. So one of the things we need to understand is that the disaster is not simply the fact that we have this president. And so the solution is not simply that we oppose him, okay? We cannot let him be what papers over our real differences. White Americans are largely racist. If we can confront that and start dealing with that, Trump is both the problem and a symptom of the problem. Because if somebody who presented himself in that way and made it very clear who he was voted in, then at best that is reckless endangerment on the part of the people who voted him. And at worst, it's active hostility towards all the people in this country who had the most to lose from him. So I would say what's important in terms of moving forward is also recognizing how profound the problem is, that it is not merely, oh, we're going, it's a bad time, I'm not a big fan of, the normalization, the Sean Spicer, the fucking Emmys, comedians, ruffling Trump's hair. It's all those dots are connected. That's easy for those people to do. We have to recognize how profoundly problematic this is. And it's not about, oh, can't we all get along? It's about saying, yet again, our white neighbors have failed us. They need to face that. They need to confront that, and we need to confront them with that, even if it seems rude. I'm a guest of honor here, and I'm saying things that are making you uncomfortable. But you or your people voted for Trump. And people are getting deported. And people are dying. And people are being incarcerated. And the established American liberal order is being ripped to shreds. I was struck by how hard it was for some people that we've seen at this conference to even countenance the role of race in this thing. Some of the smartest people in the world.
We have a question in the middle down front.
Hey, I'm Taj Frazier, representing Bard Early College in New Orleans. And I had a question for the youth. What advice can you give us so that we can eliminate this mediocrity in our social institutions and factions of government, per se?
Well, I'll answer that briefly. It can't be eliminated, and I'm actually, I don't like the word eliminate. There can be no top-down solution. But hold yourself to a higher standard than the people around you, and yeah, find your people and do the work. It's not gonna go away. It's always gonna serve some people's purposes to be mediocre, but you don't have to be them.
Thank you.
We have a question up on this aisle in the middle back.
Is this on?
Mic's not on.
You want to try to project?
Just talk. Okay. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yeah.
So you talk about the mere fact that the art that comes from disaster is good. What is art in your perspective? Okay. What is art in your perspective, and can art be in any form? Can it come in the form of happiness or sadness? And personally, from what I know of disaster is horrible, but what comes after disaster is usually pain, suffering, and heartache. So why do we tend to expect the usual outcome of disaster instead of evading disaster altogether to expect something new?
Okay, I'm going to try to understand that. First, art, of course, can be in any form. I mean, it is wherever you've had some kind of quintessence of concentration, focus, presence, and whatever way that comes out, that's art. Okay, so when you can register, I mean, an art, when it's really doing what art does, it's almost like you're a conduit for something. You have focused and concentrated yourself in a way where something comes through you and reaches beyond you and your circumstances. So it can be in any form. Most art is pig shit. Who said that? I'm quoting someone, but most art is bad. And that's also true of the art that comes out of disaster. Most art made in response to 9/11 is mawkish. It's not good. Okay, people are serving their sentimentality rather than bringing us into some fresh, new thing. I mean, you can sort of appreciate it in polite terms. And so I want to actually think specifically about how hard it is, in disaster or not in disaster, to do work that lives past its moment, work that can genuinely help and console another person. And that is why it is important, that some other person can find a lifeline in it. Some other person can go to it and find something that is in the midst of the inferno, something that is not the inferno. And it makes all the difference in the world. For me, this past year has been really, really hard. I've been profoundly unhappy to be in this. And I know that more than anything else, what has helped me is great art. Art that is made either in response to this, or art that was made outside of this, but that I have access to. And that could be going to see Terrence Simon's photographs, or seeing Mahler at Carnegie Hall, or listening to Frank Ocean, wherever it is layered and humane. The reason it's so hard to put it into words is because it's so intense and it's so close to sublimity. And yet, when you're with it, when you recognize it, when it helps you, nobody can argue you out of it. And I think the desire for an artist, for a writer, for a photographer, for a painter, for a filmmaker, for a dancer, for a musician, even for a critic, even for scholars, the desire is to be close to that, to make that on behalf of somebody else, because others have made it on behalf of us. But I don't think art, just for art's sake, is good enough. I think it has to be extraordinary. It has to try to be extraordinary for it to really do its work.
I would just add to that, quoting Teju from earlier, the piece that you saw at Hessel. You said it's an affective work of the Black American inner landscape. And one of the overwhelming things about this disaster, as you describe it, is so much of our daily lives and our experience are of an external world which doesn't fit with the way that we see the world. I'm using we, you know. The idea that art can give us the inner landscape as not antidote, but alternative to the outer world that absolutely is incomprehensible, but that allows us through art to comprehend someone else's innerness and realize, oh, there's a lot more in us than we can see currently before us.
Absolutely, and that outer world is brutal and it's grinding. I mean, there have been many bad things about this past year. One of them is having just to read such degraded language. We know what language can do. My God, we value poets. And to have to confront the opposite of that every day. We don't even have to go as far as the poets. I mean, I'm not saying, Elizabeth Bishop and, Thomas Tranströmer, and that, fine, we can do that. But even reading the paper, reading a well-edited magazine is still something. And now to just see this kind of, it's not just misspellings, it's things that don't follow. And you can just tell it's bad thinking. And it's degrading, actually, because too much of that, and then you're lessened by it. Like eating bad food, like eating Doritos all day long. And you can't say it doesn't have an effect on you, right? So that going to art becomes not just, not simply consolation. In the first instance, it's simply relief. The logic is clear. The words are spelled correctly. There's adult thinking here.
Let's have one more question. Again in the center, on this side.
You know what? Can we have this person?
Oh, has this person been trying to ask a question? Sorry. Sir?
You're putting things in a certain context, and you're speaking of nuclear energy. I'm thinking of someone who has an itching to activate the nuclear codes. Have you thought beyond the use of the nuclear codes, what kind of world we might be in, and what you think our response should be in anticipation of that real event possibility?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's something I've thought about, and it's something I wrote about earlier this year in my photography column. What if the disaster becomes the apocalypse for us in our time? But even there, it's not evenly distributed. It will always affect some people worse. Some people will survive it. And yet, the suffering will be extensive. I mean, I think it's quite similar with something like climate change. I think people get it wrong. Climate change is not going to wipe out humanity. It's not. It's just going to be a lot of death, suffering, and migration. Like, a lot. And so there's a way in which what does it mean to prepare for an apocalyptic future? I think there has to be policy, there's got to be legislation, there's got to be disaster preparedness, there's got to be infrastructure and all of that. But on an artistic level, if we think we need the deepest of arts now, we'll need it even more then. I was looking at the photography that was made in Japan in the wake of Fukushima. And it was so interesting to me the ways in which some of the most resonant and moving and frankly beautiful projects were examples of art at the extremity. It's not like art stops, Lewis Thomas, physician and writer in the early 80s, wrote an essay called Late Night Thoughts on Listening to Mahler Ninth. I commend it to you. This is the early 80s, and he sort of has this imagination of disaster, that we've got nukes pointed at each other, and all it takes is one moment of craziness, and everything we love is obliterated, and cities are going up, And And I thought it was interesting that he wove this in with listening to Mahler's Ninth late at night. Because both in terms of our anticipation and for those of us in the aftermath, it's still art that acts as that reminder that there's more to this than what the worst human beings might want us to believe.
Teju, thank you for reminding us of this moreness.